Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in the Middle East? Have you wondered specifically what it might be like to live in the UAE or Abu Dhabi? Am I putting strange new thoughts in your head that you've never had before, like those subliminal messages that are supposedly in commercials, but we never know? You've probably heard of Dubai. That's pretty popular. But not a lot of people know about its sister city, also known as the capital of the UAE, aka the United Arab Emirates. Well, as someone who has lived in the UAE, I have found that it is one of the most interesting countries and cultures, so I want to give you guys the lowdown on what it's like to live in Abu Dhabi. So after my last video, a lot of you guys expressed interest in the part of my life where I lived in Abu Dhabi, and I guess that makes sense because for a lot of people, it's something that's very new. And even though it's become very popular over the years, I still think there's a lot of nitty-gritty details and little things about their culture, things that you can really only learn by living there that a lot of people still don't know as tourists or as people who have only seen Abu Dhabi through pictures or through influencers or YouTube or Sex and the City. If you watched that movie, don't tell anyone that I recommended it to you. I watched it in middle school. I was in a dark time. But I thought it was cool that they filmed it in Abu Dhabi, which is where I was living at the time. Let's start with fast facts, because who doesn't love fun facts? The UAE stands for the United Arab Emirates, and that's because it's a country that's made up of 7 emirates. Think of emirates as like a province or a state in other countries. A massive land that is bigger than the city but smaller than the country. Now Abu Dhabi is a city in the UAE, but it's also considered an emirate. Even though there are specific neighborhoods and districts within each emirate, the emirate itself is also just known as one big city. Kind of like how we call Seoul a city, even though it's technically a province and there are actually many neighborhoods and districts within Seoul. Or Greater Los Angeles. You know, Los Angeles covers a lot of different areas like Hollywood and Glendale, Eagle Rock. I don't know why these are the names that come to mind. So yes, Abu Dhabi is actually the capital of the UAE, not Dubai as most people would think. Like most capitals seem to be some obscure little town that no one's ever heard of that's not actually the major famous city in that state. I don't know why they decided to do it that way, but they do. So yes, even though Dubai is a more famous, bigger, more metropolitan kind of city, the tourist hub of everything, Abu Dhabi is still the capital. And I do think there's actually quite a few special things about Abu Dhabi that sets it apart from Dubai and actually in some ways makes it a little bit nicer to live. When I was in the UAE, which was around 2012 to 2014, we celebrated our 40th or 41st National Day, which, as the name suggests, is the day the UAE was born. Wikipedia time. Was officially established in 1971. You can basically think of it as a baby country. It is not a very old country. We actually had to learn UAE history. It wasn't the most exciting history just because not much had happened. It was only 40 years old, but it is very interesting to hear how the discovery of this massive desert and empty land turned into this flourishing mega metropolis by the early 2000s. It definitely boomed a lot. Its main resource, as some of you guys might know, is oil. Another huge aspect of living in the UAE is that it is a majority expat country. Now, I believe by now there are almost 10 million people living in the UAE. When I was there was maybe about 10% native local Arabs and 90% expats, obviously. Math. So a lot of foreigners end up getting jobs there, like teaching, for example, is very popular, teaching at an international school, or oil companies, or engineering companies, like my dad. Now, to give a brief introduction of how I got there, if you haven't watched my other video, I moved to Abu Dhabi in 2011 with my dad because he was working for an engineering company that had a lot of overseas bases, and one of their bases happened to be in Abu Dhabi, or now as it is in Dubai. And Dubai is where my dad still works, and so that's why I go back to visit a couple times. And so it's not a frequent trip, but every time I do go, there are definitely specific things that I notice about the culture and about living there that I think if you ever plan on visiting or even think about living there, getting a job there, or if you're just curious about what it's like, these would be things that are fun and helpful to know. Hopefully I'll also dispel any stereotypes or misconceptions or misunderstandings you might have about living in the Middle East. Now, the first thing I want to do is actually highlight some of the differences between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Culturally and socially, I do think that they share a lot of commonalities, but as places to live, as locations, and as their sort of vibe and environment goes, I do think that there are some key differences for you guys to know. So you've probably heard of Dubai before, or at least you've heard of like the Dubai Mall or the Burj Khalifa, which is, I believe it's still the tallest building in the world, or the Burj Al Arab, which is actually a hotel. So yes, generally speaking, both cities can be seen as fairly wealthy, and that's just kind of speaking of the country as a whole. The UAE government actually takes care of a lot of their national locals by providing them money from the oil. I do think that it's really part of the culture as well as the religion that they consider themselves one community. So in short, yes, people there are rich, or at least some people are. I'll go into that a little bit later. Not everyone is rich. Let's just make that very clear. So yes, there are many skyscrapers and cool buildings to see in Dubai, and a lot of hotels. Even just going to visit a hotel and check out the grounds is actually something that a lot of tourists do. Dubai is a lot of glass buildings as well as some gold or sand colored buildings, whereas in Abu Dhabi, a huge color is white. And white is like a really big symbol for Muslim culture. It symbolizes purity and cleanliness, and it really does make all the buildings look super clean and beautiful. I do love the architecture in Abu Dhabi. I think there are a lot more traditionally styled buildings. The biggest and most beautiful mosque in the UAE is actually in Abu Dhabi. It is the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque. Oh, just for future reference, Sheikh is the name of the king or the royal head of the country. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the UAE is technically a monarchy, although they do have a prime minister, but the Sheikh generally represents more of the face of the government, and it's usually the name that people know. So if you see the word Sheikh, you know that means king or royalty. Another recent addition is the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is like the Louvre Paris, although much smaller, and it's designed by the French architect Jean Nouvel, whom I really love. I think it does an excellent job of combining local culture with contemporary aesthetics. Overall, I do think Abu Dhabi feels a lot more peaceful and less industrial than Dubai. Dubai has more of the bigger malls and sort of the westernized shopping luxury that you picture when you see Dubai in tourist books, whereas Abu Dhabi, I think, has a very unique and tranquil beauty. And I do think it stays a little bit truer to the minimal Emirati aesthetic. I'm combining religion and etiquette into one section because their religion is what directly affects their etiquette and social customs. The UAE, like most of the surrounding countries in the Middle East, are Muslim. It is a Muslim country, and that does come with some strict regulations. And I do want to mention before I talk more about this that I really don't want to bash on their religious culture or their customs. And even if some of these ideas or traditions may seem old-fashioned or different from your values and your beliefs, I just want you guys to be open to hearing about them and to know that this is what's expected of you when you go there. This is their culture, and yeah. As a Muslim country, there are some rules and etiquettes that you really should follow, that you have to follow because sometimes it's illegal not to. Like for instance, there is no PDA in the UAE. Like you just don't do it. PDA as in like making out on the streets. Like you don't do that. I don't remember, but even hugging with the opposite gender might be frowned upon. I don't think that'll get you arrested. Making out definitely will. If you're in the privacy of your own house, and if you're not being seen in public by anyone else, you're free to do whatever you want. It's just in public, there is no PDA. That's what PDA is, public display of affection. Yes. Dress code. The other biggest thing would be the dress code. For guys, honestly, like, you guys got it good. You guys don't really have to worry about that much. But sorry, ladies, you do have to cover up your shoulders and your legs. I think as long as it's right above the knees, it's okay. But no like tank tops, no tube tops, no booty shorts. Also, I might be wrong about this, but I do believe when I was there that you can't really say anything bad about the sheikh or the royal family in public. Like again, you can say whatever you want on a private chat. I don't think they're really stalking those, but if you like, I don't know, start complaining about them on the subway. And yes, there is a subway now. There is public transportation in Dubai. I don't know about Abu Dhabi. I never had anything to say about the government, but if you go there and if you just end up somehow being vehemently against their political ideas, yeah, just don't do it unless you want to get arrested. When I was in Abu Dhabi, we were not allowed to talk about the country Israel, and that's just because of the big political division between Israel and a lot of its surrounding Muslim countries. And we weren't allowed to visit Israel, and if you had just come from Israel, you couldn't enter the country either. Which, you know, as a Christian, that kind of sucked because it meant I couldn't go visit the country where my religion had been birthed. Religious freedom in general is also another thing. I did go to a church. I went to a Korean church. There are Korean churches everywhere. I think that's just a fact. I went to an Onnuri church, if you know what that is, but we weren't really allowed to, you know, publicize it. So when we had retreats, we actually had retreats in a hotel, and we had to be very careful about how we were seen by the public. We couldn't say that we were from a church. We couldn't say that we were having a church retreat. Now, you may not believe this, but the UAE is actually more liberal and a little more westernized than a lot of the surrounding Muslim countries. I'm just going to use Saudi Arabia as an example. Honestly, I do think the UAE is a much more preferable place to live, especially if you're a woman. Like in Saudi Arabia, you can't walk outside alone if you're a woman. In the UAE, like that's totally acceptable as long as you're not wearing like a mini skirt. I do think the UAE is much more open to women being educated, women having freedom, and just because of their industrial and economic growth and their tourism, they do have a lot more Western influence, which is a perfect segue into the next section. I don't have to question. So I just wanted to quickly add that I am not trying to imply that Western culture or Western values are any better than Eastern values. And I don't want anything I say to come off from a colonialist perspective in which Eastern cultures are only celebrated when they adopt Western values. Now, I will talk more about this in other videos based on Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, but now back to this video. So just in case you were wondering, am I only going to have to eat Arabic food if I go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai? Will there be grocery stores and brands that I recognize? Will I be able to buy the new Nikes? The answer to all of that is yes. Materially and economically, the UAE is highly developed. And one thing you'll notice if you go to the malls is that they import a lot of Western brands. They have, you know, the classics like Zara, H&M. I do think their cultural leanings are a little bit more towards the British/European side than the American Western side. So you will find a lot of those European brands and names than the common American ones. For example, they don't have a Walmart. We do have a Costco though, and an IKEA, and Shake Shack. Shake Shack is quite popular. So something I've mentioned already, but kind of want to go a little bit more in depth with, is this idea of a man-made metropolis. And I think this can definitely apply to both cities, but I would say maybe it leans a little more towards Dubai just because almost everything there feels artificial. When I first moved to Abu Dhabi, I remember leaving the airport and following this highway, this road that was just lined with palm trees in an actual desert, like in the middle of the Middle East. There are no palm trees growing unless you find an oasis. Back when the UAE was discovered, it was not an oasis. It was just a desert. So you can say that any of the greens that you see there are definitely going to be not artificial, but planted. For sure. A lot of apartment complexes and hotels will have their own beach. Like the beach is just built for the hotel. Like my apartment complex, for example, we had our own beach and the water was always warm and there were no fish because it was artificial, which is kind of strange to think about. And you wonder, like, how do you even do that? How do you build a beach and build an ocean? So yeah, that's pretty common. There are several man-made islands as well, like Yas Island, Palm Jumeirah. Palm Jumeirah is a cool one where you go through an underwater tunnel. So yes, if you stay there for a long time, you kind of start feeling the sense that, oh, everything is kind of manufactured. Kind of like being in those suburbs where all the houses look the same, except it's a metropolis. So if you're someone who loves nature, like green nature that's not a desert, then it might be a little hard for you to live there. There are no mountains, there are no hikes, it's just all flat land. If you're on the freeway going from one end of the city to another, you can literally just see the desert all around you. But you know, there are some cool things to do in the sand too. Dune bashing is pretty fun. That's when you go on a jeep and you go up and down these big hills, and you can go sandboarding, which is like snowboarding but on sand, obviously. And you can go desert camping. which sounds fun, but was actually a little bit disappointing because you don't actually get to go out into the middle of the actual desert, the wilderness, and pitch a tent there and ride a camel like you see in those movies. Again, Sex and the City. Like, you have to sign up to go to this designated area where they have a bunch of tents, and then they have these performers and these buffets. It's like, you can't get away from the buffets. Oh yes, weird thing I'll just add here because I don't know where else to add. Golf courses, like golfing, is somehow a big thing. Horseback riding is a big thing. And hotel buffets. Yeah. If you're there, you're probably gonna go to a buffet at least once, even though it's like crazy expensive, like everything else there. So schools. There are public local schools that some of the local kids or other kids go to, but pretty much any expats will go to international schools. Honestly, mine was pretty small. They were really new. They had just started out. But yeah, you want to do your research and find out which kind of school you want to go to. Generally, there will be British system schools and American system schools. And obviously, if you're used to one, then you might want to just stick to that. But if there's a certain, college that you want to get into, or if you want to live in Europe, for example, in the future, you might want to check out the British system schools. And regardless of whether it's American or British, both schools will offer IB programs. That's the International Baccalaureate, which I'm a little bitter because I never got to do that. My school, we never got IB until after I left. Although people say it's just kind of a lot of work. So I don't know if I missed out on anything. So I would say overall, if you end up getting into a good international school and you can afford it, because most of them are generally pretty expensive, but actually a lot of companies will sponsor their workers' children to go to these schools. Like, for example, my dad sponsored me to go to a school, so we didn't have to pay any of the fees, which is why I could afford to go to such an expensive international school. Some of them do actually have tests for you to get in, like American Community School, which everyone wanted to go to, but they were a little too elite for me. But yeah, if you do manage to get into one of those, then you're set for a pretty good education. And you really do learn from perspectives all around the world. Like, you'll have classmates from every country, and then you'll have teachers from a lot of different countries. Now here is the most interesting part I found about UAE culture, and which I saved for last because I really wanted to go deep into this one. The UAE is, I think, the only country where I've lived where the socioeconomic disparity as well as the hierarchy is so distinct. It is very clear, it is very visible, and as soon as you walk in, you'll know exactly where you are. This is definitely generalizing, but I do think that because it's so clear, it's a little bit easier to categorize. Generally, the socioeconomic hierarchy would go like this.
The blue-collar workers at the bottom. And now, mind you, pretty much all the workers in the UAE were foreign, but these were given more of a special label because they were very distinguishable by their looks, because most of them were from the surrounding countries like India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines. These would be the workers in all the service industries and construction. Then we have the middle-income workers, who are more commonly known as the expats, and generally these would come from more Western countries like teachers. These would be the business workers, the diplomats, the higher-up level members of corporate society. And then at the very top we have the native locals, who made up a very small percentage of the population, but were by far the wealthiest. And obviously they were very distinguishable by their traditional Emirati dress and appearance.
Oh yes, one thing I forgot to mention. What do you call people who are from the UAE? You call them Emiratis. A lot of the people who fell into a lower socioeconomic class lived in the same neighborhoods. Like, there are the big, tall buildings in cities, and then there are the luxury hotels. But then there's also the streets where people are super crowded and people are actually taking the metro or walking along the streets. And there are outlets and discount stores, places where you can actually see poverty. And it was really strange to see that at first, but it wasn't something that I had never noticed before. Domestic workers were also very common. A lot of my friends had maids in their houses. It was just normal to have someone helping around the house. My dad actually, he had a driver when he was working there to get him to different meetings because he had to travel a lot while he was working. Sometimes when I needed to get somewhere, my dad would just be like, call the driver. I was like, okay. And it was very strange because I had just gone from living in Vancouver, getting everywhere on buses or by foot, and living in this really tiny cramped apartment, and then moving to this place where I was suddenly treated like I was upper class, and it was very strange. I do think if you go there for the first time, you might be a little bit overwhelmed by how available wealth and luxury is, but also at the same time, how great the disparity is between those who are at the top, those who really don't do a lot of labor, and those who are doing all the labor. The service industry workers are very friendly and they are very attentive to you. They would open doors for me, smile at me. They would call you like Miss or Mr. or Ma'am, I guess depending on your age. So they will always kind of mark out your status or your rank very clearly. Honestly, like they would treat me like royalty. I knew real royalty there. There was a guy in my class who was an actual prince, like his mom was a princess. And maybe that's where the culture or the tradition came from, or maybe that's just how the workers are trained. And then the weirder thing is you actually get used to it. And now if I go back, I feel like I'll just kind of expect this feeling of being treated like I am in this upper class than them. And you know, if you go to like a restaurant in the US or even in Korea and you have a server, you know that wherever they are in life, they are a similar human being to you, especially if you're my age, you know, still just kind of starting off your career. You don't really feel like there's any difference between you and the person who is serving you. In the UAE, that's not the case. You knew who they were. You could clearly mark them out because most of them were from the same countries or the same ethnic backgrounds. And I have watched horror videos of these workers' living conditions, and honestly, it's kind of crazy to me to think that in the same tiny city, some people can be sharing a cramped room with 10 people, and some people can be living in palaces, which I guess is true of almost any country, but I think in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai, it is much more visible and is clearer. The lines are clearer. In terms of the upper class though, like the locals, I do think most of them are pretty open to foreigners and to the, I guess, expat middle class. Like I never really felt a division between me and the local kids, but I do think between the locals and the foreign workers at the bottom, the gap is pretty big. But this is all coming from my perspective and what I saw while I was living there. But yes, I think I have talked quite a bit. I think I have talked enough about Abu Dhabi and about Dubai and really covered some of the basics of what it's like to live there, the culture. There are so many unique aspects to living in Abu Dhabi that I really don't know if I can cover it all in one video, but I hope this was just kind of a glimpse or a taste of what it would be like. Thank you guys for watching this video, and if you liked it, please hit subscribe and leave any comments below if you have more questions. So keep checking out the channel and I will see you guys next time. Bye!